Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today let's discuss Rabindranath Tagore's poem Gitanjali, Song First. Gitanjali, Song First. Rabindranath Tagore, 1861-1941. Gitanjali means song offerings, is a collection of poems and spiritual hymns by Rabindranath Tagore, originally written and published in Bengali language in 1910 and later translated into English by Tagore himself. The English translation, published in 1912, gained international recognition and led to Tagore's winning the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913, making him the first non-European laureate. The poems in Gitanjali explore themes of divine love, devotion, spirituality, human connection with God, and the search for eternal truth. They are deeply influenced by Indian bhakti, that is devotional traditions, Sufi mysticism, and Upanishadic philosophy, where they carry a universal appeal. Summary of Song First. The poem begins with a Tagore's humble devotion to God, where he sees himself as a mere vessel or flute through which God's divine music flows. The poet expresses gratitude for life's endless gifts, recognizing that his soul is constantly filled with divine energy. He sees himself as a transient being, but a one that is eternally connected to the infinite through God's presence. The poem conveys a deep sense of surrender, where the poet's individual identity dissolves into the greater divine existence. Context of the poem. Rabindranath Tagore's Gitanjali, meaning song offerings, is a collection of deeply spiritual poems, first written in Bengali in 1910 and later translated into English by Tagore himself in 1912. Song First serves as the opening poem of the collection, setting the tone for the poet's humble surrender to God. It reflects Tagore's fusion of devotion, that is bhakti, and a universal humanism. The idea that the divine resides within and constantly renews the human spirit. Written during a time of spiritual introspection, the poem embodies Tagore's beliefs that poetry is an offering of the soul to God, much like a prayer. Line by line summary of the poem. Thou hast made me endless, such is thy pleasure. Tagore begins by acknowledging God as the creator of an eternal human soul. The poet expresses gratitude for being part of God's infinite creation and a divine joy. The next lines. This frail vessel, thou emptiest again and again, and fillest it above with a fresh life. The body is seen as a fragile vessel that God continually empties and refills. This reflects the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth, emphasizing divine renewal. This little flute of a reed thou hast carried over hills and dales, and hast breathed through it melodies eternally new. The poet compares himself to a flute in God's hands. God breathes divine music through him, suggesting that human creativity and expression are channels of God's energy. At the immortal touch of thy hands, my little heart loses its limits in joy and gives birth to utterance ineffable. God's touch transcends the limits of human emotion, filling the poet's heart with unspeakable joy. The utterance ineffable refers to spiritual inspiration, something beyond words or intellect. Thy infinite gifts come to me only on these very small hands of mine. Despite his limitations, the poet humbly receives divine blessings. This line highlights human humility and the boundless generosity of God's grace. Ages pass, and still thou pourest, and still there is room to fill. The poem concludes with a vision of infinite divine love, unending, ever-flowing, and constantly filling the human heart. Even after receiving endlessly, the soul still yearns for more of the divine presence. Themes in the poem: divine-human relationship. The poem portrays a loving, intimate bond between the human soul and a God, one of devotion, surrender, and gratitude. Infinity and eternity. Tagore explores the eternal flow of divine love, contrasting it with the finite nature of human existence. Humility and devotion. The poet's self-image as a fragile vessel or flute symbolizes total surrender to divine will, a key idea in the Bhakti tradition. Spiritual renewal and rebirth. The image of being emptied and refilled represents the soul's constant renewal through divine touch. Creativity as divine expression. The flute symbolizes art and poetry as instruments of divine expression. Creativity is not merely human, but is sacred. Joy of union with the divine. The poem captures the bliss of communion with God, an ineffable, overwhelming joy that transcends ordinary experience. Symbols and their meanings used in the poem. Frail vessel. The human body or soul that holds divine spirit symbolizes fragility and a dependence on God. Flute of a reed represents the poet or artist as an instrument through which God plays divine music, creativity inspired by God. Music is a symbol of divine harmony and the rhythm of life. Hands of God represent a divine creation, guidance, and a renewal. Small hands is a symbolize human limitation and a humility before God's infinite grace. Now the key interpretations. Divine inspiration. The poet suggests that his poetry and creativity do not come from himself but are inspired by God's presence. Gratitude and surrender. There is a theme of complete submission to the divine will, a concept found in Bhakti poetry. Human life as a divine gift. The poet acknowledges that his very existence is due to God's grace, and thus he seeks to live in alignment with the divine.